I'm very excited about this presentation. I heard our speaker speak a while ago, and I was so interested in what he was saying. I immediately jotted down his book, and immediately, actually, I got the audio version, which he reads, passed it along to my husband. He liked it so much. So I think that you really enjoyed this talk, and hopefully you might want to either buy the audio or the hard copy of the book. Our speaker is Ty Seidule, and Ty is a local boy. He grew up in Alexandria, which makes the book particularly interesting to read when you know the names of the streets and you can picture where he is. He then went to Washington Lee University, then joined the Army and had a significant active career in the Army, both in going to the Gulf War and then ultimately working with the NATO in terms of crisis planning in Kosovo. He then became a professor at West Point University and for quite a few years there, and is a Professor Emeritus of History at West Point. He currently now is with Hamilton University. He's a visiting professor. He's been there for 4 years, and his career seems to go on and on and on. So this book that he will be talking about, excuse me, Robert E. Lee and Me, is a wonderful historical adventure, but it's also his personal story about coming to reckoning with who Robert E. Lee was. So I hope that you'll share my enthusiasm, because I think Ty Seidule is an excellent author, an excellent reader, and the topic is extremely compelling. Ty?
Thank you so much for the introduction, Louise. Really appreciate it. And it's great to talk to everyone here in the DC metro area. I am talking to you from Bethesda, which is where both my boys and their wives and my 1-year-old grandchild is. So we're down here from Central New York visiting. I am a native of Alexandria. I grew up between Quaker Lane and Braddock Road on the campus of Episcopal High School. Alexandria shaped my character, my worldview. More about Alexandria in a bit, but I'm honored to talk to you today about my story. And my story is rooted in history. And what is history? It's storytelling with a purpose using evidence. So I'll say that again. History, for me, is storytelling with a purpose using evidence. And leaders and really everyone tells stories using evidence for a purpose. And I learned the hard way, however, that facts don't change people, but stories do. And this afternoon, I'm telling stories. I hope to tell you some ruthless truth. So my story, the story of Confederate monuments, and the story of how our country stopped commemorating Confederates in the military. So my purpose, first, I hope to make you uncomfortable. I feel uncomfortable telling my own story. I feel uncomfortable about this country's racism, but uncomfortable causes no lasting damage. In fact, uncomfortable is called education. Second, I want to tell you why I think we must confront the history of the Civil War and our Confederate legacy, including monuments. And if you see Confederates for what they were, I think we have a better chance of understanding who we are today. And my third purpose is I believe we can make a difference individually and collectively. But first, we have to understand our history. So I hope to give you some of my hard-earned wisdom through history. So first, my story. Let's see if I can change the slide here. Having trouble doing that. Should be easy, but even the easy is hard.
Are you able
to? Okay. There we go. So in 2015, I wrote and recorded in my Army uniform a video called "Was the Civil War About Slavery?" And I answered the question in the first sentence. The citizens of the southern states were willing to fight and die to preserve the morally repugnant institution of slavery. It was a 5-minute story, and the video went viral. And today it has 35 million views on YouTube and Facebook. Oh my gosh, I received death threats. The Army investigated me for political speech. I thought I was going to be fired for commenting on something that happened 150 years ago. Then what did I learn? That history is dangerous because it challenges our myths and our identities. Telling the truth is a ruthless act. I also learned that I have a face made for podcasts. My son sent me a link to a website where they made fun of my looks. And so let me give you a couple of examples here. People said I look like an alien. Many wrote that my face proved there really was an Area 51 and the feds failed to lock the front gate. Who knew, said another, that a light bulb could wear glasses. One wrote that I didn't have a 4 head, I have a 5 head. Funny and true. Recently, I had to take my phone number off my college website. Every day, someone harasses me on social media or by snail mail. Why? Why are people so upset? I'm challenging their understanding of history. Many people grew up with a version of history that was a myth, a lie called the lost cause of the Confederacy myth. That is, that the white South went to war to protect the myth was so here's what really happened, not the myth. The white South went to war to protect and expand the institution of slavery. They sowed the wind, and by 1865, they reaped the whirlwind. The South lay in ruins, 60% of Southern wealth gone, a quarter of all military-age men dead, and slavery, the most valuable asset in America, gone. How would the white South deal with such a catastrophic defeat? They changed the meaning of the war, first in Virginia, and then by the 20th century, the entire nation believed the lost cause. After the war, white Southerners argued that the Civil War wasn't fought over slavery. Here was the most important tenet of the lost cause myth. Because if the war was about slavery, then Confederates fought a dishonorable war for a dishonorable cause, slavery. So the former Confederates and their descendants created a myriad of reasons, everything except slavery. Yet the facts are clear. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, said, and I quote, "Our new government's foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition," end quote. The lost cause argued that the enslaved liked slavery. That's just a lie. Slavery featured legal rape, selling husband from wife, and separating mother from child. As the war progressed, the enslaved voted with their feet, fleeing slavery and joining the U.S. war effort, both men and women. Did the Confederacy lose because it had fewer resources? Well, tell that to Vietnam, the Taliban, or us during the American Revolution. The U.S. had to mobilize like no country had ever mobilized before during the Civil War. It had to conquer an area twice the size of France and Germany combined. It had to maintain the will to fight. Often war really is about will and logistics. The U.S. won because it had better leadership and a righteous cause. Lost causers argue that Reconstruction, that period from 1865 to 1877 after the war, was evil. No, it gave us the first civil rights laws and the 14th Amendment, promising equal rights under the law for all. It gave us a birthright citizenship. In fact, during that period, 2,000 Black men held elected office. Reconstruction was a valiant attempt to create a biracial democracy. It ended in part because of the success of white political violence, terror. Robert E. Lee was the hero of the lost cause, the greatest man who ever lived, they said. More on him later, but how could the greatest military man ever lose? And not by a little. His army was destroyed. The lost cause was my culture as a kid. By the 20th century, most white Americans, from sea to shining sea, believed this lie. The lost cause had a pernicious purpose: to ensure white people maintained political power at the expense of Black people. Starting in the 1890s, new Southern state constitutions deprived African Americans of citizenship. White Virginians boldly proclaimed the purpose of their constitution in 1902. Congressman Carter Glass exclaimed, quote, "Discrimination, why, that is precisely what we proposed. That exactly is what this convention was elected for, to discriminate with a view of the elimination of every Negro voter who can be gotten rid of," end quote. The new constitutions enshrined segregation. White supremacy was enforced by a terror campaign of lynching. White mobs lynched 5,000 Black men, women, and children, often grotesquely, like some medieval period in the South. So how do I know about the lost cause myth? Because I studied it for the last 20 years, true, but here's my secret, my uncomfortable fact. I grew up with this myth, believing this lie. And that's me on the left with hair, rocking the plaid bell bottoms. And if I had hair, I would still be wearing those pants. I'm a proud child of the 70s. On the right was the picture that hung over our mantle when I was a kid, the 4 flags of the Confederacy. The one on the far right was the national flag for most of the Confederacy, called the Stainless Banner, mostly white. Why white? Well, here's what a Savannah newspaper editor said about this flag. Quote, as a people, we are fighting to maintain the heaven-ordained supremacy of the white man over the inferior or colored race. A white flag would thus be emblematical of our cause. Uncomfortable. End quote. They wore their white supremacy proudly. Uncomfortable. The flag we think of as the Confederate banner today was actually the flag of Lee's army. On the bottom, you'll notice it says Dixie. I hate to admit this, but as a kid, I learned the words to Dixie before I learned the words to the Star-Spangled Banner. The song starts, I wish I was in the land of cotton. Old times there are not forgotten. And what are the old times? Slavery. It's horrible. My culture reinforced the lost cause. And you'll notice here, my first chapter book. Lee looks like a god on loan from Mount Olympus. Notice the little orange line in the corner? It's a book for kids. I grew up worshiping Lee. On the Spinal Tap scale, if any of you have ever seen the great movie, the mockumentary, This is Spinal Tap, I would have rated Lee an 11 out of 10. And even though I was a good Episcopalian, a head acolyte when I was in high school, I probably would have put Jesus in the 5-6 range. Lee, to me, was a more tangible God, uncomfortable. On the right is my 7th grade history textbook. The African family dressed in colonial finery is supposed to be exiting a ship from Africa, entering slavery for generations. It looks like they just got off a Princess cruise ship. No, they just crossed the Middle Passage. 15% of Africans died on those hellish voyages. The book describes slavery as a type of social security, kind masters and happy slaves, terrible lives. And what about the whip? Just the way fathers discipline kids. These books were written in the 1950s and the 1960s, and teachers used this Virginia history textbook through the 1970s. Virginia politicians created them to teach the virtues of slavery and segregation. Uncomfortable. I grew up in Alexandria, and I know you're thinking, maybe some of you live there, it's not really the South, it's a DC suburb. But when I was growing up, it was a lost cause outpost. I didn't know that Alexandria used to be part of the District of Columbia. President George Washington, demanded his hometown be in the district. Today, the Potomac forms the western boundary. Alexandria retroceded to Virginia in 1847. Why? To protect the slave trade. When that happened, the free blacks in the city cried. All the black schools and churches shut down. 3 years later, DC closed the slave trade, and all those businesses went to the huge slave market in Alexandria, home to dozens of prisons. Uncomfortable. And you'll notice on that slide, on the left, that map, there are these granite pillars, and they're all around the city, and they're still there to this day, that mark the original 10 by 10 mile, 100 square mile DC capital. Uncomfortable. And when I lived here, we had Confederate monuments like this one on Prince Street. Why are monuments a big deal? Most Confederate monuments went up between 1890 and 1920. Confederate monuments celebrated the return of Southerners to political and social dominance. The whites were back in the saddle, they would have said. And I should say the white South. Too often we say the South, the white is silent. That Prince Street monument was taken down several years ago. Now, names are another form of commemoration, of a monument. In the 5th grade, I went to Douglas MacArthur Elementary School, an all-white school on Janney Lane, a Janney named after a Confederate. For the 6th grade, I was bused across town to the segregated all-black school. And that's the picture of it there on the right. What was it named? Robert E. Lee Elementary, named in 1961 as a protest against integration. The other all-black segregated school was named Stonewall Jackson. Uncomfortable, even cruel. Confederate memorialization was all around me, but I didn't even notice. Alexandria, Virginia still has more streets named after Confederates than any other city in the country. Why? Alexandria spent only 6 hours in the Confederacy before the United States Army occupied it. In 1953, Alexandria passed a law to name new streets after Confederates. Guess where? It was the African American section of town. Confederate memorialization protested Truman's Civil Rights Commission and the court cases that would become Brown versus the board, leading to desegregation. Scratch a Confederate monument, and it either celebrates white supremacy or protests equal rights, two sides of the same coin. And I'm happy that the mayor of Alexandria, Justin Wilson, has a plan to start getting rid of those slowly but surely. Remember, when I was born, the South was a racial police state, an apartheid region. America, I would argue, has only been a democracy for about 55 years. Before that, 30 to 45% of the Southern population couldn't vote because of the melanin in their skin. Uncomfortable. My family left Alexandria as my dad took a job as a headmaster at a new school in Monroe, Georgia. George Walton Academy was founded as a segregation academy. 400 SEG or SEGI academies were created in 1969 alone when the federal government finally started forcing the white South to integrate. The purpose of my school was to ensure white kids didn't go to school with black kids. I played football for the Bulldogs. We played 12 other teams, all segregation academies. Uncomfortable. I did not know then when I lived there that my new home was the site of the last mass lynching in American history, the Moores Ford lynching. In 1946, a posse of white men stalked, trapped, and slaughtered 2 women and 2 men, one of whom was a veteran. The purpose? Terrorize the black community, stop them from voting, and enforce white supremacy. Despite a platoon of FBI agents camping in Monroe for months, no one was ever indicted, much less convicted. Yet I knew nothing of this, clueless to the racial violence all around me. I left Georgia for college. I chose Washington and Lee University because I wanted to be a Virginia gentleman, like Lee. I wanted status and power. That was my culture. Uncomfortable. When I was there, I took an ROTC scholarship because I ran out of money. I spent nearly 4 decades in uniform. I'm a proud soldier. I love my country. But at the age of 18, I'll be honest with you, I joined for the money. Here I am in the 1980s, here in 1984 with my 1980s hair, next to a picture of my then hero, Robert E. Lee, in Lee Chapel. That statue of Lee is of him resting on the battlefield in Confederate uniform. There are no Christian symbols in the chapel. The entire chapel worshiped Lee. His basement office was untouched since the day he died. The chapel store sold Lee finger puppets. It was a reliquary to a saint. Uncomfortable? Maybe even blasphemous. Just outside the chapel, Lee's warhorse Traveler is buried. Today, visitors leave pennies face down on his grave marker. Why? So that the hated Lincoln can't see Traveler's master, Lee, buried inside. I received my commission there in the chapel, surrounded by Confederate flags. Uncomfortable. Then I raised my right hand and took the oath everyone who serves in the federal government, including the military, takes to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Ever wonder why it talks about domestic enemies? Because the oath was written in 1862. It's an anti-Confederate oath. Yet I took that oath surrounded by Confederate flags. I started my Army career the next day at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, named after Confederate Braxton Bragg, a terrible commander and a worse person. Bragg not only lost nearly every battle he fought, he was also a terrible enslaver, sending children to the fields at a very early age to pick cotton. The Army had 9 posts named after Confederates, named for the enemy. The old names of these posts reflect traitors, war criminals, terrible generals, and cruel enslavers. Let's talk about a couple of them. Fort Gordon, Georgia, who's in the middle there, is named for Confederate General John Brown Gordon. He never served a day in the U.S. Army, but he killed U.S. Army soldiers. After the war, he gave a speech to black citizens of Charleston. If they demanded equality, he said, the 40 million white people will exterminate the 4 million black people in a race war. He founded the Ku Klux Klan in Georgia. Uncomfortable. Let's talk about Fort Pickett. Pickett famously led one of the divisions on day 3 at the Battle of Gettysburg. Of course, it was a suicidal charge, now called Pickett's Charge. Pickett also summarily executed 23 U.S. Army soldiers in 1864. And when the war ended, he, like so many other Confederate leaders, skedaddled to Canada rather than face the possible noose. These posts were named in World War I and World War II. See if I can get a slide about that. Not right after the Civil War. Remember that during the World Wars, the military was segregated, believing in white supremacy, racist through and through. Read this report from the Army in 1932. Quote, "The Negro is lower in the scale of evolutionary development than the white. Ignoring the bravery of the black soldier in the Civil War and World War I, white Army planners thought black soldiers wouldn't fight because of unadulterated racism. Wrong. Uncomfortable." One other monument right near here deserves mentioning. The Arlington National Cemetery, Confederate monument. It belongs to the U.S. Army, and I believe it's the cruelest monument in the country, with an overweight enslaved, quote, mammy figure taking the baby from her Confederate enslaver. The figure is meant to show that the enslaved supported the Confederacy, supported slavery. It's a pro-slavery monument. Remember, monuments tell us more about who put them up than about the actual figure memorialized. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the most successful propagandists in U.S. history, put this up in 1914 to show that the white South was right and the United States was wrong. And as part of our commission work, the naming commission, which I'll discuss in a minute, it's coming down and soon. I spent half my career as a tank and armor officer and cavalry officer, and the other half as an academic at West Point. And there I had an epiphany. My family lived on Lee Road by Lee Gate in Lee housing area near Lee Child Development Center. One day I walked past our barracks. West Point names its barracks after the greatest heroes in American military history: MacArthur, Washington, Eisenhower, Pershing, Grant, Sherman, and Lee. Why was there a barracks named after Robert E. Lee? He was only a colonel in the U.S. Army. So I ran around posts looking, and I found 12 things named after Lee. And then I changed. And what changed me? 3 things. First, my identity changed. I no longer cared about being a Southern gentleman. I wanted to be the best Army officer I could. Serving in the Army changed me. Second, my wife changed me. She is incapable of lying. I grew up in a racist culture defined by lying. And it took her a couple of decades. I'm slow, but she changed me. And the third thing that changed was I was now a scholar, a historian. The archives changed me. The facts changed me. And I found that in the 19th century, West Point officers banished Confederates as traitors. I read the U.S. Constitution. There's only one crime. Article 3, Section 3, levying war against the United States is treason. That blew me away. Treason. They killed U.S. Army soldiers. And it's not the Union Army, it's the U.S. Army, wearing the same blue uniform I wore, the same blue uniform George Washington picked during the American Revolution. So I looked around posts, that's what we call Army bases, our campus. There were no Confederates in the cemetery, none on Battle Monument, this huge monument dedicated to those who died during the War of the Rebellion. That was the official name of the Civil War in the 19th century. Heck, even our motto, duty, honor, country, also anti-Confederate. Duty and honor only matter if it's for country. So when did the Confederate memorials arrive? Back to the archives. The first Confederate memorialization happened at West Point in the 1930s. That was when the first Black cadet in the 20th century graduated. That was Benjamin O. Davis Jr., later leader of the Red Tails, the Tuskegee Airmen during World War II. The white cadets silenced him. During his 4 years, no white cadet talked to him. In the isolated West Point, that was a form of psychological torture. Yet he endured and graduated. Lee Road and Lee Housing Area and Beauregard Road were named during this time. And this portrait of Lee in gray with an enslaved servant was done in 1952, when the Army was fighting to stay segregated, even though Truman had ordered the Army to integrate. Lee Barracks was named in the 1970s when minority admission started. Instead of a handful of Black cadets coming each year, now there were dozens. Confederate memorials protested integration. All Confederate monuments celebrate white supremacy or protest equal rights. sort of the same thing. When I realized that, it ticked me off. Seriously, I was mad at my own obtuseness, mad at the institutions I love. West Point and the Army had visible signs of racism all around, and nobody noticed. Nobody cared. Then I started looking at my hero, Robert E. Lee. Lee is the godlike figure of the lost cause religion. Is his supposed greatness also a myth? Here's what I found. No other Army officer profited from enslaved people in the U.S. Army more than Lee. Lee took 2 years of paid administrative leave from the Army, longer than anyone else in the antebellum Army, to run his father-in-law's plantations. Man, I tell you, I hate that term plantation. It makes me think of hoop-skirted ladies sipping iced tea on the veranda, saying fiddle-dee-dee. No, plantations were gulags, sites of mass atrocities, rape, torture, labor theft. We should call them enslaved labor farms because they harvested two things, cotton and humans. Enslavers would rape enslaved women and then sell their own children and grandchildren. As I told you, I have a 1-year-old grandson. To see my son with his son, I have never felt such joy. In the enslaved era, fathers and grandfathers would sell their own children and grandchildren. It's beyond uncomfortable. It's just monstrous. Lee had enslaved men and women whipped. He separated husband from wife, mother from child, even though his father-in-law never did this. What about Lee's decision to fight for the Confederacy? Did he have to go with the South? No. In 1861, there were 8 U.S. Army colonels who hailed from Virginia, all West Point grads. 7 remained loyal to the United States. Lee and only Lee chose treason. Why? Because he believed in slavery. Full stop. During the war, Lee's army used thousands of enslaved people for his army's logistics and demanded more from Jefferson Davis so that he could free more white men up to shoulder arms. When Lee went north for the Antietam and Gettysburg campaign in 1862 and 1863, every part of his army kidnapped free Black people and brought them back to Virginia for sale. His army slaughtered African-American prisoners of war, and that's the reason that the parole exchanging prisoners of war stopped, is because the South and Lee's army refused to accept Black prisoners of war. After the Civil War, Lee testified before the U.S. Congress that if it was up to him, he would kick out all Black people from Virginia. He advocated racial cleansing. Bottom line, Confederates like Lee refused to accept the results of a democratic election and chose armed rebellion, treason, to fight for a hideous cause, slavery. The two sides aren't equal. There were good guys and bad guys, and the good guys all wore blue. Now I had the research. I knew about the lost cause, how it infected me, how it infected the Army in West Point. Uncomfortable had converted to anger and, obviously, as you can tell, to passion. I started researching and writing about the history of African Americans at West Point, and I changed more. Really, that was the fourth thing that changed me. One year, my boss's boss asked how many underrepresented minority officers we had in the Department of History. And out of 55, we had 1. And we gave the reasons that we always gave in the Army. It's hard, we're really trying, it's just impossible. And I thought, maybe if I studied the history of African Americans at West Point, I could understand the issue better. Amazingly, no one had ever studied the history of African Americans at 20th century West Point, and I became the expert, me. Well, how? I just did the work. And that led me to lecture to what was effectively the Black Student Union. And then I served as one of their mentors. And then I helped change our policies to bring in more underrepresented minorities to West Point, and then helped develop programs to keep them at West Point. And I mentored Black officers, started an oral history program focusing on Black graduates. And the more I did, the more I changed, the better my organization became. The better leader I became, the more empathetic. And so I changed. I think we had the Department of History change, yet I couldn't convince anyone above me about the problem of Black cadets living in Lee Barracks. I tried. In 2011, we had lost more than 100 graduates killed in the wars on terror. And yet there was no single spot at West Point to recognize them. I chaired the memorialization committee and came up with an idea to create a single memorial room to the more than 1,500 West Point grads who, in Lincoln's word, gave the last full measure of devotion to the nation in Cullum Hall, which was our memorial room, our memorial hall. And everyone loved this idea of a new memorial room. But one problem, should Confederate West Point grads who died in gray go in the room? I knew the answer. So did the black officers I served with. And I argued brilliantly, just ask me, no to traitors, no to those who killed U.S. Army soldiers, no to those who tried to create a slave republic. And I briefed the superintendent, our college president, and other senior leaders and gave them my argument, and I lost. I could not convince them. They voted to honor the Confederates. It's about 2010, 2011. One senior leader said honoring Confederates had nothing to do with race. I tried to argue with him, couldn't convince him. And I went home, defeated, tail between my legs to tell my wife. They wouldn't listen to my brilliant argument. Well, she asked, did you fess up about your own background? Did you tell them why this is so important to you? I said, no, I tell other people's stories. I'm a historian. I can't tell my own. That's too uncomfortable. Well, she said, if you don't tell your own story, you will never convince anyone. Of course, she was right. Uncomfortable. First, I should say that black graduates found out about those names going in, and they raised a ruckus, and they finally changed it so those names didn't go in. But it wasn't me that succeeded. So I followed my wife's advice in 2017 at my alma mater of Washington and Lee University in Lee Chapel, the same place I'd received my commission. I told my story, revealed my own background, and called Lee a traitor for slavery, standing over his grave. Told my college to deal with its racist legacy. And what was the reaction of the packed, nearly all white audience? A standing ovation. Blew me away. Facts don't change people's minds, but stories sometimes do. By telling my story first, by being vulnerable, by telling the ruthless truth, folks listened. That same year, when white supremacists marched in Charlottesville, I wanted to write about Army base names, named for the enemy, but it was too difficult to do that in uniform. In 2020, I retired so I could openly discuss this issue. Now I was on a mission. I was a convert. I wrote a book, and in the book, I told my story, this story about Confederate monuments. Again, I found that history is dangerous, and I won't read all these to you, but I received and continue to receive one-star Amazon reviews, as well as mean-spirited social media trolls almost daily. I love it. Bring it on. Doesn't bother me a bit. I send those troll comments to my kids. As soon as they come in, we all laugh. As the saying goes, I'm living rent-free in their heads. In my book, I didn't only tell the stories of Confederate traitors or of violence. I told the stories of heroes hidden from me as a kid, heroes that fought against injustice. I don't want less history. I want more. I found the story of Samuel Tucker in Alexandria. Born in 1913, he had to bootleg an education, traveling by streetcar to D.C. to get a high school education. Then he went to Howard University. He wanted to be a lawyer, but no law school would take him. So he passed the bar on his own at age 20. In 1939, he led the first sit-in in American history to integrate the Alexandria City Library. Then, during World War II, he fought in a segregated unit in Italy before coming back to Virginia and arguing more than 150 civil rights cases. Samuel Tucker is my hero now. We all need heroes. My hometown named a new elementary school after Tucker. Lee Elementary is gone. Tucker is there in its place. My story now included heroes like Tucker. On the one hand, I scolded. On the other, I found hope. And I tried to tell as many people as I could, as many stories as I could. Now I wanted to make other people uncomfortable. I wrote a bunch of op-eds arguing that the nation must stop honoring Confederates, especially in the military. That was my way to fight injustice. And when folks understood the history, they often became more empathetic, more willing to embrace diversity. Then, in the summer of 2020, a policeman in Minneapolis murdered George Floyd. Congress at last passed legislation to change the name of everything in the Department of Defense that commemorated Confederates. President Trump vetoed that big bill because he too revered Robert E. Lee and didn't want to change the names. But Congress, our Congress, overrode that veto by a supermajority. The base names would change. Man, was I excited. No one else had ever written about Confederate commemoration in the military. It was now national news, and I was the only expert. In January 2021, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin asked me to serve on the naming commission to make the changes. What's the definition of a nanosecond? That's how long it took me to say yes. Highest honor of my career. Again, I raised my right hand and said that anti-Confederate oath. Now I could not only tell my story, I could help implement a solution. Our mission: remove, modify, or rename everything that commemorates Confederates in the Department of Defense, and finish by September 2022. We found 1,111 items, from base names to street names to ship names to monuments. I'm proud to report that we did something that I know of no other government project doing, at least in a couple of decades. We finished on time, under budget, and the Secretary of Defense accepted and implemented 100% of our recommendations. Excuse me. Our main task was to change the names of 9 Army bases. As we went to each post to tell them and get their input, they always told me, "You're changing your history." Oop, there's the ones that we changed for. Let me go back. But as we went to each post to tell them and get their input, they always told me, "You're changing history." No, we're changing commemoration. At West Point, we will teach the Battle of Gettysburg every year. And every year, Pickett will charge, and every year, Lee will lose. Commemoration is about our values. It's about who we honor. It's about who inspires us. Well, you couldn't tell the story of John Brown Gordon. It's too awful. And after they visited the Army, it's too awful. But instead, we went to these Army posts and we asked the American people what they thought about what we should do. We got input from everyone on the bases, and even we went and did a website, and there were 34,000 suggested names by the American people, including the name Fort Spears, as in Britney Spears. Yes, Americans have a sense of humor, but our new names, they inspire. Here are some of those new pictures of those new names, so let me give you one example of that. Henry Benning, the namesake of Fort Benning, the home of U.S. Army infantry and armor, never served in the U.S. Army. Again, he killed U.S. Army soldiers, though. He once said that he would choose famine and pestilence for his home state of Georgia rather than ending slavery. After the war, he fought to create a white supremacist Jim Crow society. Our new namesake is Lieutenant General Hal and his wife, Julie Moore. Hal Moore is famous for fighting in the first big battle of the Vietnam War, Ya Drang. Made famous in the Mel Gibson movie, We Were Soldiers. But we honor the Moore family, not just Hal. Julie Moore was an Army wife for decades, raised 6 kids. When Hal was in Vietnam, dozens of his troops were killed or wounded. Notification of that horrible news came from a telegram delivered by a cab driver. Julie Moore, horrified, had the cabbie stop by her house first, and she went to deliver the news, comforting the family. She forced the Army to start a casualty notification process that we still use to this day. We named that post after an Army family. I attended the ceremony. All the Moore children were there, with grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The troopers of the 7th Cavalry Regiment that Moore led in Vietnam also present. Now that post has changed its motto. It's now Be More, inspirational. You see, it's never, ever too late to do the right thing. Here's another name that we chose. Fort Polk in Louisiana honored Leonidas Polk. He founded the University of the South, Sewanee, where my dad went to school, to educate pro-slavery Episcopal clergy. During the Civil War, he was called the Fighting Bishop. Military historians, me included, consider him to be the worst general of the war. No mean feat. We changed the name to honor Henry Johnson. Johnson fought with the segregated Harlem Hellfighters in World War I. The entire 93rd Division fought with the French in French uniforms because General John Pershing, the American commander, didn't want black soldiers. Wounded 29 times, Johnson became one of the first Americans to receive the French Croix de Guerre. Teddy Roosevelt called Johnson one of the bravest soldiers in American history. When he returned to the U.S., they had a parade down Fifth Avenue. And when he got to Harlem, they started to call him by his nickname, Black Death. He never received care for his wounds after the war or a pension and died in poverty. 100 years later, President Obama gave him the Medal of Honor posthumously. Now we have a fort named after him, inspiring tens of thousands of soldiers who will train there every year. Again, it's never, ever, ever too late to do the right thing. And here's another one. I mean, they're all my favorite, but this is one of my favorites. Fort Lee is the home of Army logistics and is now Fort Gregg Adams. Charity Adams was the highest ranking Black woman in World War II. She commanded a battalion of all Black women, the 6th AAA Postal Battalion. They took a broken mail system in Europe and, working around the clock, ensured the troops and the folks back home got the mail. Look for the Netflix movie about this sometime in 2024. Lieutenant General Arthur Gregg was the highest ranking Black officer in the Army when he retired. He commanded the largest battalion in Vietnam and helped integrate the Fort Lee Officers Club. At other posts, we recognized a Black soldier, so he commanded that, and he is still alive and was there at the ceremony at the age of 95. Inspirational. At other posts, we recognized a Black, I told you about the Black soldier from World War I, the first Hispanic to receive 4 stars, the only woman to receive the Medal of Honor. Before our commission, not one post in the military was named for a Black soldier or a woman. We realized that for the Army, for the nation, it's never too late to do the right thing. So I spent 20 years railing against honoring Confederates, especially in the military. I failed time and time again to make the Army's senior leaders see Confederates commemoration as an issue, as a racist legacy. And now those names are gone. 90% of what I wrote about in my book has now been changed. Before the name change, we couldn't tell the stories about Gordon or Benning or Polk. Their stories were too awful. They represented the worst parts of America, slavery and segregation. Now, all soldiers can hear the inspirational story of Charity Adams, Arthur Gregg, Hal and Julia Moore, Henry Johnson. Now our posts represent our values. At West Point, everything named after Lee and the Confederates, gone. See, before the names changed, we couldn't tell those stories of Gordon or Benning or Polk. Their stories were too awful. They represented the worst parts of America, slavery and segregation. I'm proud of the very small role I played, proud of the bipartisan commission, proud of the Army, proud of the nation. The reason we changed those names, stopped all commemoration of the Confederates, is because the American people, through our elected representatives, told the military to change. You made it happen, and all of you should be proud to commemorate those who reflect our values. Remember that history, it didn't change here. It's commemoration that we're changing. We're changing who we honor. It isn't changing the history. It's making sure that we commemorate those who deserving of commemoration, who represent our values, who inspire us. So let me make sure I accomplish my mission today. So here are a few takeaways. Remember, the Confederates chose treason, killed U.S. Army soldiers and sailors, and tried to destroy the country we love to create a slave republic. They do not deserve our commemoration. We should study them, but we shouldn't commemorate them. Confederate monuments were created decades after the Civil War to celebrate white supremacy and the end of biracial democracy that we had during the Reconstruction. Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, and 2 million U.S. Army soldiers, including 179,000 Black soldiers, destroyed chattel slavery, freed 4 million men, women, and children from human bondage, and saved the United States of America. I told you history through my own story. Why? Because stories change people's minds more than facts, the ruthless truth. I hope you will study the history of your family, your town, and your country. History makes us uncomfortable. So what? We Americans aren't made out of cotton candy. We can handle uncomfortable. We don't own the actions of those who lived in the 1860s or the 1930s or the 1960s. But we do have an obligation to understand the past. When we recognize our true history, the facts, we can become more empathetic. Only then can we agree on policies to make our country better. But people won't change until they understand our history. Today, we recognize that we have come a long way. Today, we recognize we have a long way to go. Today, we can celebrate true American heroes. They inspire us. And tomorrow, I believe, we will all act to make our towns, our states, and this great nation that we love a better place for all Americans. Thank you very much. And I'd be happy to take your questions.
Ty, that was terrific. I replayed the book in my mind, or listening to you, the audio, and it gets better and better, and the more you tell the story, it's really an important story, and I really can't say enough. And I really encourage everybody to listen to it again on the audio book or read the book. So, thank you very much, Ty.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Louise.
Thank you. We do have some questions. Jonathan Ruskin says, I understand Lee's Quaker teacher at the boys' school he attended in Alexandria instructed that both slavery and war were wrong. What, if any, influence did these teachings have on Lee?
None that I can tell. I mean, he was an Army officer. He loved war and he loved slavery. So as far as I can tell, not a darn thing. Nothing. No. I mean, this is a guy who right. I said just one quote. 10 days after the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the enslaved in the rebelling states, including in Alexandria, that was behind U.S. lines, Lee said that we must win this war, or the worst things will happen, and that is the end of our social system, which is slavery, which he said we couldn't stand to have, and the pollution of our families. And by that, he meant that this fear of black male sexuality, that somehow black men were going to rape white women, when in fact, it's the exact opposite. So to this day, we know now from 23andMe that if you look at the DNA of those enslaved, of those people today who trace their heritage to the enslaved era, they're between 20 and 23% European DNA. And why is that? It's because of the ubiquity of rape. It's because most young white boys and men had their first sexual experience with an enslaved girl or woman. So the immorality, the monstrous immorality of the slave era, I don't think is something that we as Americans grapple with enough. And I will certainly say that Robert E. Lee, not only did he not do that, he was a firm believer in the social system. Remember, it wasn't that they had slavery in the South. It was that it was at a slave society.
Thank you. Chad Lash makes the comment to you, Brigadier General Seidule. I grew up in Alexandria in the same climate you experienced. Your book encouraged, chastened, and inspired me. I ended up at VMI near your alma mater, looking forward to your presentation. So I'm sure he's.
Oh, well, yeah, thanks, Chad. I mean, I know, both Washington Lee and VMI are dealing with what is, Lexington used to have on its license plate Shrine to the South. I mean, it was a Confederate tourist organization. Lee Chapel was called the Westminster Abbey of the Confederacy. VMI cadets would salute Lee Chapel as they walked by. So the lost cause and this sort of racist ideology is almost entwined in the DNA of VMI, WNL, and Lexington. I will say Washington Lee has gotten rid. It's no longer Lee Chapel; it's University Chapel. They have stripped everything out of there, all the lost cause imagery out of the chapel, and they have put a barrier between that the shrine, which is Lee Chapel was a shrine. Lee was on the altar. It looked like he was, sort of the godlike figure there. They put like a wall between the two so you can't see it. It still needs an exorcism, but it is far better than it was.
Chad also added another comment. Your photo at the ANC Confederates tombstone shows his ancestor's name. Uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think there are at that Confederate monument. There are 400 some Confederate graves around there, and remember that those were put in by McKinley or started by McKinley as after the 1898 war, because by that time the South was a racial police state. It was a one-party state because blacks had been excluded from the vote. Remember, by 1900, South Carolina and Mississippi were still majority African American, and yet they had no vote. So this was a way to appease the white Democrats who were in control then, segregationists. Remember that the only way to pass legislation is to ensure that you appease them. So that's why Social Security, for instance, when it passed in the 1930s, excludes workers, it excludes domestics, laborers, and farm workers. That was because that's the only way that Southern segregationist lawmakers would pass it. So there's a reason why black families have 1/10 the wealth of white families. It's because when generational wealth was started and then created and passed along, blacks were purposefully excluded from that starting in the early part of the 20th century by policy. Thanks for that, Chad.
Jack Crawford asked the question, should statues of Lee and others be removed and melted down, or should they remain and have explanations added, possibly counterpoints or possibly counterpoint statues?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So I'll give you a couple of examples of each. They're the ones in Richmond. So that one of Lee is so monumental that there's no museum that is big enough to put it in there. However, the Jefferson Davis statue that was torn down in the riots of 2020, by the way, I do not condone any violence. There was a person gravely injured in Portsmouth when they pulled down a Confederate statue and it hit the guy on the head and he's got traumatic brain injury. So I certainly don't recommend that. But that part of the Jefferson Davis one in Richmond, so it's down, beaten up with pink paint splashed on it, and it is in the Valentine Museum there. That's great. They also had an exhibit at the Los Angeles Museum with several of those Confederate monuments. However, leaving it, and again, this is something that each local community should decide. What I really protest against, and which I don't like, are states like Alabama, Tennessee, and others that don't allow local, and Mississippi, that don't allow local communities to make that decision for themselves. So I was just giving a talk in the Jackson Civil Rights Museum, and there are a bunch of Confederate monuments in Jackson, but the state has passed laws that don't allow Jackson, which is 90% African American, to make decisions to take them down. That to me is wrong. Now, I'm not saying some rural county in Tennessee, let them decide. But for those cities that want to take them down and you don't let them, to me, that's terrible. As for melting it down, again, local decision as far as I'm concerned. I have no problem with the melting down. These things are so grand. If you do leave it up and you leave this, you put a little marker. So if you have a 70-foot statue and a 3-foot marker, it's still the level of the difference between those. It's still, the commemoration is huge. It's up high. So I still think there's a problem with that. But on the other hand, that's still better than nothing. So at Gettysburg, for instance, I'll give you one example in Virginia, and that's at Manassas. And the fact that Manassas battlefield is called Manassas, that's a Confederate name. It should be called Bull Run. That's what you say. It's Antietam, not Sharpsburg. And Bull Run is the name of is the U.S. name of it, but it was given the Confederate name. And if you've seen that statue of Jackson there, he's steroidal. It's Jack Jackson. I mean, Little Sorrel has muscles upon muscles upon muscles. So, but that's not going down. And that's not going down because it belongs to the National Park Service. Congress has to make the decision on those. So I think it's a local decision, but they're so monumental that you can't just put them up in museums. There just isn't room for that. So I think it's a local decision on what to do with them.
Thank you. Dale Welch poses some thoughts here. I think we need to be careful about not getting into current politics too much here. So I'll read this, but caution about current politics a little bit. When we say Donald Trump admires Robert E. Lee, I think when you say that, I think you are assigning a quality to him he doesn't possess. He's transactional. He's only interested in appealing to the lowest possible denominator. White supremacists are simple and reliable voters.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue with you on that at all. I'll just say that I think it's a political decision, but I'm just saying what he said. But I think you're right. There's more to what he's saying there. But what I think I would say to this is that I've been incredibly surprised by the lack of that this subject has not caught on in the culture wars. So there have been in our when we were doing our to rechange. Have you heard anything about those names? Well, there've been only 2 politicians that have said anything about the name changes of the bases, and that was 2 with Pence and DeSantis. Excuse me, and DeSantis said that they would change the name of Fort Liberty back to Fort Bragg, but that didn't catch on, and nobody's brought it up. So the idea, really, that I would argue is that the American people are saying, "Listen, we don't want commemoration in the military." The only one that has caught on a little bit is the removal of the monument in Arlington. And that is because some people they're wrong. They think it is a grave marker. It is not a grave marker. Graves are around it, but it's not a grave marker. And it is, to me, the cruelest monument in the South. Our remit from the Congress was to remove, remodify, or rename anything that commemorated the Confederates. And we saw nothing that commemorated the Confederacy more than that statue. So there has been a little bit about that, but on the whole, I mean, compared to all the other things that you would think the culture wars would do, that has not been this. So I've been really amazed that between the white supremacist massacre at 2015 at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, the white supremacist violence in Charleston, in Charlottesville, the Unite the Right, and the 2020 George Floyd, has changed in many cases, not completely, lost cause is still out there, but has changed the minds of many Americans on how they should view the Confederacy. And so I think I'm really heartened by that. And that's why, at least in the military, they're saying, we should not have things named. Because remember, the military is the most diverse workforce in the country. Fort Gregg Adams, the most diverse, with 50% Black soldiers there. We should not have those things named after those who chose treason to preserve slavery.
Thank you. Thank you. By the way, the statue that you're referring to in Arlington Cemetery, I think you mentioned to me earlier that that's scheduled to be removed.
It is scheduled. It is going through, anytime you remove something in the district, well, sort of the Virginia/district historical area, there are more wickets to go through than there are on everything else. So everything that the Army owned, except that, everything has changed. The only thing left to do really is to remove that. And I believe it will happen sometime in early 24, but that has not happened yet. But that's the only thing that hasn't gone away yet. And I'm sure that one day it will be gone. And because it's on Arlington, it'll be impossible to see. I believe that what will happen there is that it will be, I made up a verb, and then I believe it will be Raiders of the Lost Ark. So if you know the end of that movie where they take the Ark of the Covenant, they put it in a big box and they shove it in some Army warehouse, well, I think that's what will happen, at least for a while, with that statue.
Be lost forever, ever and ever in the bureaucracy of the warehouse.
Right. That's what I'm hoping.
Okay. Jay Churlow poses, typically the winners get to write history. Why didn't this happen with the Civil War?
Yeah, it's a great question. So if you could, again, part of this is that when the white South went to war to preserve slavery, and then after the war, they are trying to deal with this catastrophic defeat that they created, and they lost. And so they're trying to deal with this. And so really before the smoke clears on the Appomattox battlefield, already it's starting. And Lee is starting by saying we fought an honorable fight and we lost because of overwhelming resources. Well, again, that's part of the lost cause myth. Then Jubal Early, a Virginian who was in the Shenandoah Valley and was just crushed by Sheridan, comes back and starts the Virginia Historical Society, and they write over and over again a couple of things. Lee is the perfect guy. Longstreet was to blame at Gettysburg, and why is Longstreet to blame? Because after the war, he becomes a Republican and fights for biracial democracy. There's a great new book out by Elizabeth Barron called Longstreet, which talks about his post-war career. He worked for Grant. It's really amazing. And so because Longstreet became a Republican and fought for biracial democracy, I'd argue he's a much better corps commander than Jackson on the Confederacy. And yet there are no statues to him until one goes up in the 1980s in his hometown of Gainesville, Georgia. And there's one in Gettysburg that comes up in the 1990s. That's a reaction to the movie Gettysburg. Other than that, it's not there at all. So this, and then once that starts, Jubal Early and the Virginia Historical Society, they're writing, and then the next thing is the United Daughters of the Confederacy. These are the daughters and granddaughters of Confederates that start this huge campaign to memorialize it. Not only do they do that, they check every textbook. They have a list where you have to ensure every text, because really what they're going after are the children. A checklist for every textbook that goes in the South, and they're checking worldwide, and they're burning the books that don't make that list, and it's all the lost cause things. Then the next thing they do is they start the Children of the Confederacy, started in Alexandria, which is still extant to this day. And you can memorize the lost cause, which they still do to this day, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and go on the website and look it up. They have the Confederate Catechism, which you memorize for scholarship money. And you can still get those scholarships to this day. And that's another way. So they go after the children to make sure that they learn the lesson. That's what my dad got. That's what his dad got. So it's a generational effect to ensure that. By the 1900s, there is this idea of reconciliation, but it's a reconciliation between white people, the white North and the white South, to agree that that they're going to exclude the black people. So the lost cause is to ensure white political power at the expense of black people. And by the 20th century, with the Union U.S. veterans dying off, this idea comes into full play and really is accepted nationwide. So it's a long period, but I just finished a class on this. So one of the classes I give is about basically how this, and then how it changes again, starting in the late 1960s. There are a couple of people that fight against this completely during the time. So Black America keeps the idea that the war is really an emancipationist. It's about the freedom of the enslaved. And Frederick Douglass does this very well. W.B. Du Bois does this well. And then finally, in the 1960s and 70s, a current historian, Eric Foner, does it. So now 99% of all academic historians are writing, understand this lost cause, write about that, and understand that this was a lie. But the idea that it all is based on what the Civil War is about. And if you say the Civil War is about slavery, that's why the South seceded, then you understand that this war was not fought for honorable conditions, changes the way everything is done. So that's really the foundation. If you can get that to school kids, then everything else follows. And that's why history is dangerous, because it challenges our myths and our identity.
The Daughters of the Confederacy, how big an organization is that?
Well, it was huge. It's a lot smaller now, but I mean, you can go on their website and see the, I don't know, dozen chapters in California. They're chapters all over the country. Since the 2020, when their headquarters was firebombed in Richmond, they have been very, very quiet. The Sons of Confederate Veterans have been much louder. And so they are the ones that are creating the huge flagpoles on I-81 as you're going into Lexington. Huge flagpoles with monstrously big, gargantuan Confederate flags flying there. So they've been more active, whereas the Daughters have been very, very silent in this. Try not to say, they say we're not racist, but their underlying theme is, and they have been the one, they were the most successful propagandists in American history. They are the ones that built this. It was amazing is they built these statues. They did this propaganda before women even had the vote. I mean, if they weren't after such a terrible cause, you'd have to admire them.
Jerry McLaughlin makes a statement and has a question. The official name of Arlington House is Arlington. Oh, it just left here.
Yeah, I saw that. I know that one. Thanks, Lise. So basically, it's Arlington House, which is, so if you up on Arlington National Cemetery, at the top is Arlington House, and then that belongs to the National Park Service, and all around it is Arlington National Cemetery, which belongs to the U.S. Army. So Arlington House is actually, its official name is the Robert E. Lee Memorial. Why is it the Robert Lee Memorial? Named in 1955 as a reaction to integration. Scratch a Confederate monument and you get a reaction to integration or something that supports white supremacy. So that's when it was named. It has gone through a renovation over the last 5 or 10 years. I think David Rubenstein is the one that provided money for that. They do a great job of talking about the enslaved there and what it was like. The big house, however, still is mainly about the white people. And there's sort of a building near the bookstore that is sort of a hagiography to Lee still. And it still has that lost cause feel about it. I mean, there's horsehair for Traveler, and there's a lost cause era portrait of Lee. But they recently re-signed it. I was there the first time they'd ever had a meeting with the descendants of the Lee family and the enslaved family. Had a reunion there, and they rededicated for the purpose of that to tell the enslaved story. It was really a magical time. And there is a bill before Congress, and the Alexandria congressman, can't think of his name right now, is the one who is spearheading that to try to change it back to the Arlington House. Hadn't gotten anywhere yet, but the thing is that there will be another incident at some point that lets us know about the racism that's a problem in the United States. And I think it will change eventually, just because we know it's wrong. We know that's wrong to call it the Lee House. And so I certainly signed my name to that petition, and I hope it changes, because it's only been that name since 1955.
Okay. Patricia Brennan says, ask the question, do you find evidence of prejudice at West Point was also true at the Naval Academy?
Well, I don't yet. I mean, in fact, yes, the first black graduate at West Point at the Naval Academy wasn't until 1948, Wesley Brown, or 46, 48, something like that. So West Point had already had more than a dozen black graduates. During the 1960s, there was, I mean, it was very limited tokenism of Black officers at graduating from the Naval Academy, mids there, and officers. 0.2% of the naval officers and Marine officers during the 1960s were Black. 0.2%. So, I mean, it is very, very late. Coast Guard's first Black graduate is 1968. The first Black captain in the Coast Guard isn't until 1978. So, yeah, I certainly found that. There were two things that were renamed at the Naval Academy. Buchanan House, who was named after the first superintendent at the Naval Academy, who was also the highest ranking admiral or one of the high ranking admirals in the Confederate Navy. He's the one that was defeated by Admiral David Farragut, who was a Virginian at the Battle of Mobile Bay. And so they renamed the Buchanan House, which is where the superintendent lives. They've renamed it Farragut House. Beautiful. Secretary Del Toro of the Navy is the one that was responsible for the rename. We told him to rename it. He renamed it. Great choice. And they also renamed Maury Hall, named after Matthew Maury, the scientist of the seas, also a very prominent Confederate who left the South after the war and hightailed to Mexico. Again, that eventually came back when he was pardoned. But they renamed that after Jimmy Carter, 1946-47 graduate of the Naval Academy. Awesome. So yes, the Naval Academy has had huge problems with racism. It's not my area. There's a book on that, I think, but not something that I know about as much as West Point. But certainly, yes, they've had. And again, the other part about the Navy to remember is that their ratings, the Black stewards, is all they had there. The Navy was integrated until the 20th century, and then was resegregated in the 20th century and stayed that way until after World War II.
Oh, interesting. John Crowley asked the question, to some extent, are we witnessing a backlash against fact-based history in this country?
Oh, yeah. And I would say it's a great question. And I would say yes. So let me just give you a little context for that. After Reconstruction, we created the 13th Amendment ending slavery, the 14th Amendment, the most important amendment in the Constitution, guaranteeing equal rights and birthright citizenship, and the 15th Amendment ending slavery. There was a counter-revolution, which the lost cause was the ideology of that counter-revolution, which created the white supremacy reinforced by Supreme Court decisions like Plessy versus Ferguson that said segregation was equal, even though the Equal Rights Amendment, the Civil Rights Act of the 1870s that Grant signed was to prevent that. But there's this backlash that occurs. There's the civil rights, and there's a backlash against integration, a backlash against Black power, all these things, which creates the Southern strategy of white flight out of schools, the George Wallace campaign. So all of these are reaction to that. When Obama is elected, there is the Tea Party movement. There is a backlash against that as well. They're just coming closer together. And then in the summer of George Floyd, there was all these movements toward equality and equal rights. And now we are seeing the backlash against that as well. So in a majority white country as we are, we're 70% of voters, not everybody, but voters are white. We continue to see a backlash against this move to equal rights. And that certainly is the part of the populism that we see today, in my opinion.
Okay. Deborah Bisson asks, the U.S. military historically seemed to provide more opportunities for young Black soldiers than society at large. Do you think this is still the case today? Absolutely.
And it did for me. You know, my parents divorced and they, a teacher and a nurse didn't have money to send me to school. So I took an ROTC scholarship because it was the only way to get me through school. The Army or the military in America has always been a means of social mobility. You join, and either maybe your kids will join after that, or you'll move into either the middle class or you'll get more education to provide you as a means for social mobility. So yeah, it's a great place for that. It was a great place for me for that. I mean, the Army ended up paying for my bachelor's, master's, and PhD. So it is for Black soldiers as well, and that's why we are above the national average. I mean, when we went to war in the first Gulf War, we were 29% Black soldiers. Now, probably about 20%. But we're also at 12 or 13% Black officers in the Army. And that's higher than leadership in most other parts of American society. Most people that are in the military will have an African-American boss. And I can't say that's true for most professions. So I think I think it's a great point, and it's one that I'm certainly proud of that, because I hope you'll understand that I love my country. I am proud to have been a soldier for, including my time in ROTC. I served in uniform for 40 years. Very proud of that. And and the reason that we have a great military is because our military represents our great country. It's not the other way around. You don't have a great military that creates a great country. It's got to be the other way around. But in the military, we see those things, the problems that we have in society manifest themselves in the military as well. So great question. But yeah, I think it is a great place to serve. It's a great place to serve your nation. And the benefits are enormous, particularly the GI Bill, which is, when I first came in, was not that good, because I was after the Vietnam era, and just, it gave like $8,700. You put in $2,300, $2,700, and you match that 2-for-1. Not that good a deal. Today, it's an incredible deal for the GI Bill. And if you spend a career in, like I did, not only does it pay, and some of you may know this, I used it on my children. So it's your children that you can use the money to pay for college. So those things are a generational benefit. So yeah, it's a great question, a great point.
Eileen Janice asks, this is a very practical question, I think. How do I help my Southern relatives grapple with their issues of disloyalty regarding their ancestors who fought in the Civil War?
Oh boy, do I have a great answer for this one, Eileen. Buy Robert E. Lee and Me and give them that. No, I think it is that, to me, it's the change of language. It's language that matters. And what I always say to them is, first of all, I don't like people. I served in the Army for 36 years. I don't like people that kill U.S. Army soldiers. I don't like people that abrogate their oath. So I don't like people that choose treason. So for me, I start with that, about the idea as a soldier, what it means to me to the enemy, so that these folks were named for the enemy. And then the reason is so bad. And the other part is, is to give alternative heroes. So for instance, you probably have a World War II hero, a World War I hero, a Korean War, Vietnam, and say, listen, that was a 4-year, nobody recognized that country. It failed. Not one other country recognized it. It was an absolute abject. The other thing, I don't like losers, I like people that win. And so if you think about World War II, or the fact that we fought for the country of Vietnam, I think that's the way to do it. But I think for me, the way I have been able to do it is to lead with my own story first. Facts don't change people's minds, but stories do. And I think that's the way, and that's why I'm talking to you today, because I'm trying to tell this story as often as I possibly can, to change more minds and change the way we do it. But I think language is one of the ways to do that. Go after the treason argument. And that one way to put that is, they were never indicted. Well, Lee was indicted, but every single Confederate was pardoned, was granted amnesty. Pardon is for one person, amnesty is for a group. Every single Confederate was granted amnesty on Christmas Day, 1868, for the crime of treason. Say that again. Andrew Johnson gave pardons to every single Confederate on Christmas Day, 1868, for the crime of treason. I'm not making that up.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. By the way, relative to language, here in Alexandria, when we have our historical Gatsby Tavern in a lot of places, when we give a tour of that, we do not refer to slaves. We refer to enslaved people, enslaved individuals, and it absolutely has the effect of having somebody think about it for a minute.
I do the same thing. And not only do I say enslaved people, I say enslavers. Don't say masters. Right. Say enslavers. Because what it does is, as you said, Louise, it's absolutely right. Because what this does is it changes the way, it's not who they are, it's the condition that they're in. And we see that during the periods where the U.S. Army goes, freedom comes with it, and they vote with their feet. I mean, 189,000 people. That, just so we know, that's the size of the Marine Corps today, is 189,000. That's the amount that are serving, and they have a higher casualty rate than do the white soldiers. And we have hundreds of thousands of women behind line serving as nurses and sewing bandages, doing all the other work as well. So they're creating their own freedom. And by the way, while they're doing that, they're leaving the South. Remember, I can't remember what the numbers are. There's one in 3 in the South are enslaved. So this is a huge, that's one of the reasons they lose, is because it's such a terrible, because all the enslaved people are leaving for freedom and to fight with the U.S. Army, so or to support it. So yeah, I think it's what the language is: treason, traitors, all the. And listen, I'm not making this language up. This is what they called them in the Civil War and after. They said they were traitors. That would they put that on their postage stamps, and they had pictures of Jeff Davis hanging. They called them traitors, and that's what and the secessionists were. So it's really returning to the language of that period, not creating new language.
Thank you. Elizabeth Scholart makes a statement. My understanding is that Lee was named executor of his father-in-law's estate. As such, he had to protect his wife's property, including the slaves, until the estate was settled. The Civil War started before it was settled. And then she says, by the way, I grew up in Alexandria also, and my mother's family were Lees. We did grow up with a modified version of the myth. We were always taught that we were glad to be part of the United States.
Yeah, so I think the thing about Lee as an executor of the will is he was executor. He received 3 plantations, I call them slave labor farms, with that, and he took almost 2.5 years of paid administrative leave. By the way, he was also getting paid during that period. You got paid for your the enslaved servants that were with you. So he got paid extra money to have enslaved people with him. But he had these 3 things. And he said, "Oh, my father-in-law's left me with this terrible thing." Well, he tried to make that work and was very cruel to try to pay off the $10,000 dowry for his daughters, his own daughters. And what he ended up having to do was sell property to do that. He could have done that immediately, sell property, free the slaves, free the enslaved people, and just end it right there. But he didn't do that. He kept the slaves until the last minute. And then, even though there were many of the enslaved people that thought he was supposed to free them immediately, he didn't do that, kept them until that 5-year period. And then when he went to court to say, I want to keep them longer to make up this money, the court said, no, you only had 5 years. You have to release them. So he finally did a week or 2 late. But he could have, and the only way he did that was to sell property to create this dowry. He could have done that day one.
Tracy Hopkins asked the question, what's going to happen to the ANC Confederate statue? Do you
yeah,
know
great question. I do not know. The Army has the authority for that. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I would hope that for the time being, they put it in a warehouse somewhere. The commission said our recommendation was to dispose of it in the most economical means possible, whatever that might be. We didn't want them to have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to store it. But whatever they decide to do, there is a task force of implementation that the Army has, along with the Historical Advisory Committee that ANC has, to come up with that answer. And so I don't know what that is yet.
Well, Chad Lash chimed in and said it's going to the Newmarket Museum.
No, that's not accurate.
It's not accurate.
Not true. No, the Virginia, that's where the Stonewall Jackson Monument went, and the Virginia governor said he would take it, and the VMI Board of Visitors or Board of Trustees said, yes, we will do that, but the Army has not agreed to that. So I don't think that would, I personally, not knowing any inside baseball on this, I don't think that the Army will do that. If you go to that where the Newmarket battlefield is, it's run by VMI, and that Jackson statue has no context there at all. There's nothing about the lost cause. That monument outside is still a commemorative statue for Stonewall Jackson. It has nothing about why it went up, when it went up, or anything else about slavery. At least I haven't been there in ages, but looking online, there's nothing about slavery in that museum, that at least that it says online. So I don't think that the Army will allow that to go there where it would be a commemorative object.
Thank you. When Lee testified to Congress after the year, this is Jerry Howard, he said he favored manumission, which means the freeing of enslaved people. Is it possible that Lee chose the South over the U.S. Army Commission, not because he favored slavery, but because he feared violent abolitionists like John Brown, whom he had confronted in Harper's Ferry?
Well, he favored manumission after it had already happened, but he sure as heck fought like hell up until April 9th, 1865 to keep it. So no, I don't find that credible. The second thing is, if so, why is it that all the other U.S. Army colonels from Virginia did stay with the United States? Why did they do that? And I think I do believe that because he had spent that 2.5 years running those plantations, I think he thought more like a Virginia planter than he did an Army officer. And I think if you're saying that he thought more like a Virginia planter because of his time running these enslaved labor farms, then I would say that's probably true. But he did renounce his oath. And so, in fact, many of his other family members, the other Lee family members, including his sister, stay with the United States. Many cousins stay with the United States. In fact, we have a letter from his daughter who said that when Lee told that to the family, he said the family had always been strong Unionists, that they were surprised. And Lee said, "You will be surprised by my decision." So, and he went well before his sons did. And I think he, in fact, helped other people make the decision to go with the South because of what he did. And by the way, he left, resigned, did not allow, he had taken the oath just 3 weeks prior when he took commission of colonel and command of the 1st Cavalry Regiment. And less than 3 weeks later, he resigns and immediately takes a train down and becomes a part of the Virginia militia, whatever that was called, before it only took 3 or 4 days before his resignation was accepted, but he accepts. So he's basically getting paid at 2 different places at the same time when he accepts that Virginia militia commission. So I don't find that argument powerful because, as one of the other Virginia colonels said during this time, Philip St. George Cook, I think is his name, said, "When I find Virginia in my commission, then I will honor that instead of the United States." So he did not take a commission, never to the state of Virginia. It was always to the United States. So yeah, I don't find that persuasive.
Okay, thank you. Catherine Carney said, "Would appreciate your thoughts on the current efforts by certain VMI alums to fight what they perceive as, quote, wokeness changes at VMI."
In this particular case, what does wokeness mean? Does it mean dealing with the lost cause legacy? That sounds like that's the kind of woke I want to be. I want to deal with that. Does it mean that you're making it after so many problems with racism and sexism, that you're trying to make it a more equitable place, which, by the way, for those going in the Army, is demanded of those who go serve. So I know they're trying to, and there's a general's redoubt at WNL at Washington Lee, which is trying to do the same thing. I don't think they're helping. I think they're hurting their institution, and I think the money that's going to them could do better for if they were helping inside. And listen, I know BMI. That place isn't woke. Goodness gracious, it's just not. I think it's hurting their institution by trying to ensure that they don't get the diversity they need. Remember that this nation, many of them going into the Army, which is the most diverse workforce in the country. They need to be able to deal with that. So I think it's hurting VMI, and I think they're hurting their superintendent, General Wins, by doing that. So I don't think that what woke is in that particular context does not seem appropriate.
There's one more question. We have quite a few more questions, but we're running out of time, so I'm just going to ask one more.
Okay.
Jonathan Ruskin asked, "Didn't the actions to commemorate Confederates have something to do with the desire to foster reconciliation after the Civil War?"
Yeah, that's what I said earlier. It was reconciliation. There had already been reconciliation, with the sense that the United States had magnanimously gotten them back together again, and allowed them to come back in as they were. There were several senators that said we should break these apart and make new states, and we should make sure the Confederates never have the ability to be in power again. When the reconciliation starts after 1898, it's with whites in the power as white supremacists. So it's reconciliation between white America at the expense of Black America, with the heel of the boot on Black America, not allowing them to vote or be a part of society. So that's what reconciliation means when it's done after the Spanish-American War. They'd already been political reconciliation, which allowed Confederates to be part of every part of American society. This was only to allow white America to agree to keeping the heel of the boot on Black America's neck.
Okay, thank you. Well, certainly your presentation stimulated a lot of questions and thoughts and comments, and I think people felt the same way I did after I listened to you read your book. So I encourage everybody to get the book or listen to the book or listen to it or read it. It's very, very compelling. I would like to thank you personally for this presentation. I think I said to you that our members in the greater public here are kind of the NPR crowd, and you said that's exactly who we like to talk to. So you know, they're interesting people here and want to hear interesting speakers like you. So thank you very much, Ty.
Great. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you paying attention. Thanks so much.
Don't go.
Okay.
I also wanted to encourage everybody to complete the survey to give Ty some comments about his presentation and to give us at Encore Learning. And finally, because this is the last presentation of the year, I want to thank everybody for all of your participation throughout the year. We really try to give you interesting topics and a variety of topics. And I thank you for attending our presentations. And I'm so glad that we ended up our year very, very strongly with Ty's presentation. So thank you, everybody. Have a good holiday. And Ty, thank you.
Yeah, and Louise, if I could just jump in, just a couple of quick announcements. You know, the Encore Learning office will be closed from December 18th to January 2nd. The spring 2024 course catalog will be online sometime early January, and the spring course preview is scheduled for Thursday, February 1st at 9:30 a.m. So you want to put that on your calendar if you're an Encore Learning member, and if you're not a member, please check it out. The organization at www.encorelearning.net. We'd love to have you as a member. It's an opportune time to come in. So anyway, just wanted to jump in and give those announcements, Louise.
Thank you, David. So Ty, thank you. Everybody have a good holiday, and we'll see you in 2024. Bye.
Bye.